On April 2nd, 1972, a 53-year-old Air Force navigator named Gene Hambleton parachuted alone into a rice paddy in the middle of the largest North Vietnamese offensive of the entire war. The American military response that followed would grow into one of the most costly rescue efforts in its history. Hambleton had been flying aboard an EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft, callsign Bat-21, escorting a formation of B-52 bombers near the DMZ when a surface-to-air missile tore the aircraft apart. He was the only one of 6 crew members to survive, ejecting at over 30,000 feet and drifting down into terrain that neither he nor the men desperately trying to reach him, yet fully understood was crawling with an estimated 30,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, the leading edge of a massive conventional invasion that had begun just 3 days earlier. He carried, inside his own memory, detailed knowledge of highly sensitive American strategic operations, knowledge that made his capture, and the interrogation that would certainly follow it, a genuine and serious concern reaching all the way to the top of the American command structure in Vietnam. What followed was not a single clean rescue. It was a sustained, days-long campaign, involving repeated helicopter and fixed-wing attempts to reach a man surrounded by an enemy force too large and too entrenched for any of the ordinary methods that had worked in countless previous rescues throughout that war. Aircraft were shot down attempting to reach him. Men died trying. A second airman, sent in an attempt to help locate Hambleton, was himself shot down and became a second person the rescue effort now needed to save. The cost climbed high enough, fast enough, that America's senior commander in Vietnam eventually made the extraordinary decision to halt further helicopter rescue attempts entirely, judging the losses no longer acceptable against the odds of success. Hambleton could not know, huddled in the wreckage of a landscape he did not recognize, how many men were dying in the effort to bring him home, or that the method which finally succeeded would look nothing like the massive, overwhelming force that had already failed so many times before. That is the story of what a country was actually willing to spend to save one man it refused to leave behind, and the strange, quiet solution that finally worked when every larger one had not. Now let me show you exactly what that effort actually cost and how it finally succeeded. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why this single rescue grew into one of the largest operations of its kind in the entire war, you first have to understand exactly what Hambleton knew and exactly what kind of ground he had landed on. To understand the scale of the effort that followed, you have to understand exactly why one downed airman, among the many lost throughout that long war, triggered a response this large and this sustained. Hambleton was not an ordinary navigator. He carried extensive, detailed knowledge of American strategic air operations and surface-to-air missile countermeasures, information of genuine and serious value to any adversary who might successfully capture and interrogate him. The concern was not abstract. American commanders understood that if Hambleton fell into North Vietnamese hands, and particularly if that information ultimately reached Soviet advisors working alongside North Vietnamese forces, the resulting damage to American strategic operations could be severe and lasting. This specific, concrete risk elevated his rescue from an urgent but ordinary priority to something approaching a genuine strategic imperative. The ground he had landed on made that imperative extraordinarily difficult to fulfill. Hambleton came down just 3 days into the Nguyen Hue offensive, more commonly remembered by its Western name, the Easter Offensive, the largest conventional military operation North Vietnam had launched in the entire war up to that point. He had parachuted directly into the path of this massive invasion, surrounded by tens of thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers moving south in numbers and with an intensity that made this rescue attempt fundamentally different from the countless smaller, more contained recoveries American forces had successfully executed throughout the rest of the conflict. This combination, a man whose knowledge made his capture genuinely dangerous, stranded in the middle of the single largest enemy offensive of the entire war, is what transformed an already difficult rescue into one of the most complicated and costly the American military would attempt in Vietnam. Ordinary methods built around relatively small, contained pockets of enemy resistance simply were not built for the scale of what Hambleton had landed in the middle of. The rescue effort that followed Hambleton's landing unfolded across days, not hours, and the toll it took, attempt after attempt, deserves to be told honestly and specifically because the cost was real and it accumulated fast. Early rescue attempts relied on the methods that had worked reliably throughout most of the war. Helicopters escorted by fixed-wing aircraft, moving in to extract a downed airman from a position located and marked by forward air controllers circling overhead. Against the sheer scale of North Vietnamese forces now occupying this ground, these methods met resistance far beyond what any single previous rescue in the war had encountered. Ground fire from multiple directions, from an enemy force large enough and well-armed enough to genuinely threaten aircraft attempting even a brief, low approach, turned each attempt into a serious and costly engagement in its own right. The toll mounted with brutal speed. During one attempt, a helicopter carrying a 6-man crew was struck repeatedly by ground fire from every direction its pilot tried to escape through, caught fire, and crashed, killing everyone aboard. This was not an isolated tragedy within the broader effort. It was one of several such losses across the days that followed as additional attempts, launched with real courage by crews who understood exactly how dangerous the ground below them had become, continued to meet the same overwhelming resistance. Compounding the difficulty further, a separate airman sent to help locate Hambleton's position was himself shot down during the effort. Adding a second man, the rescue operation now needed to recover alongside the first. By the accumulated measure of aircraft damaged or destroyed and airmen killed across these repeated attempts, the cost of trying to reach Hambleton through conventional means had grown large enough that it eventually reached the desk of General Creighton Abrams, the senior American commander in Vietnam. Abrams made the difficult, consequential decision to halt further helicopter rescue attempts entirely, concluding that the method itself, however successful it had been throughout most of the war, was simply not going to work against an enemy force of this size and this level of preparation, and that continuing to attempt it risked losing more men than it had any realistic chance of saving. Understand what happened next, because it represents a genuine and significant shift in approach, one that abandoned overwhelming force entirely in favor of something considerably smaller, quieter, and in its own way, far more dangerous for the handful of men who actually carried it out. With conventional aerial rescue ruled out, responsibility for reaching Hambleton fell to a small joint recovery effort, coordinated by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Andy Anderson, who oversaw an organization tasked specifically with exactly this kind of difficult recovery mission. Anderson turned to a Navy SEAL named Thomas Norris, who had been working alongside South Vietnamese naval commandos, men trained in exactly the kind of quiet, small-team infiltration work that a massive helicopter assault could never replicate. Rather than attempting to fight through the enemy's strength with overwhelming firepower, this approach proposed doing the opposite entirely, moving quietly in small numbers, specifically to avoid the kind of confrontation that had already cost so many lives in the attempts before it. Norris, working alongside a South Vietnamese commando named Nguyen Van Kiet, first turned his attention to the second downed airman, a young lieutenant named Mark Clark, who had been shot down during the earlier search for Hambleton. On the night of April 10th, Norris and Kiet moved through enemy-held territory, evading multiple North Vietnamese patrols along the way, and successfully located and extracted Clark, bringing the first of the two stranded airmen back to safety through nothing more than patience, skill, and the willingness to move quietly through exactly the kind of terrain the larger rescue attempts had tried and failed to overpower directly. 2 more days of continued searching for Hambleton himself produced no results, and by this point, exhaustion and mounting losses had led many involved in the broader effort to consider the search effectively over. Norris and Keat decided to make one final attempt, and on the night of April 13th, disguised as local fishermen and traveling in a small riverboat rather than any recognizable military vehicle, the two men moved through the same dangerous enemy-occupied terrain that had defeated every larger, more heavily armed effort before them, and finally located Hambleton, weakened by hunger and exhaustion after 11 and a half days evading capture on his own. The extraction itself, on that final night, demanded exactly the kind of careful, sustained nerve that had made this quiet approach viable in the first place, and it did not unfold without real danger even at this final stage. Norris and Cutt had to move Hambleton, already physically depleted from nearly 2 weeks evading capture with almost no food, back through the same enemy-occupied ground they had just crossed to reach him, maintaining the same disguise and the same quiet, unhurried pace that had gotten them this far without triggering the kind of direct confrontation a larger force would almost certainly have provoked. At one critical moment during this return journey, an actual North Vietnamese patrol came close enough to the small group that discovery seemed like a real and immediate possibility, a danger that could have unraveled the entire mission in its final, most vulnerable hours. They made it through. Hambleton, extracted after 11 and a half days on the ground, longer than nearly any other airman had survived evasion during the entire war, finally reached safety, delivered not by the overwhelming force that had failed so many times before, but by 2 men, 1 American and 1 Vietnamese, moving quietly through the same danger that had already claimed so many lives in louder, more conventional attempts to solve exactly the same problem. This achievement earned real and lasting recognition. Norris received the Medal of Honor, presented personally by President Gerald Ford in 1976, for his role in rescuing both Hambleton and Clark. Kiet received decoration as well, formal recognition of a South Vietnamese commando's essential role in an operation that has, in the retelling, sometimes focused disproportionately on the American side of a genuinely joint achievement. Neither man's contribution can be fully separated from the other's. The mission succeeded because both were willing to move into exactly the danger the larger, failed attempts had already proven was real. It would be incomplete, and it would miss an important part of the story to treat the eventual success of the small, quiet rescue as simply proof that the earlier, larger attempts had been a mistake, because the honest accounting of this entire episode is considerably more complicated than a simple story of big force failing and small force succeeding. The earlier, costly attempts were not undertaken carelessly. They reflected the same doctrine that had, across the length of the war, successfully recovered a great many downed American airmen through exactly this kind of direct, overwhelming aerial approach. Commanders committing those helicopters and escort aircraft to the first attempts at reaching Hambleton had real, historically grounded reasons to expect this method would work again, because it had worked so many times before against enemy forces of a size and preparation the American rescue apparatus had generally been able to overcome. What made this specific rescue different was not a flaw in the doctrine itself, but the genuinely unprecedented scale of enemy forces Hambleton happened to land in the middle of during an offensive unlike anything the war had yet produced, and it is worth being honest about the price paid before the successful method was even attempted. Real men died in those earlier efforts, men whose families received the same grief and the same loss, regardless of how the story eventually resolved for Hambleton himself. Total losses across the full extended rescue effort, by the most complete estimates available, include more than a dozen men killed and numerous aircraft damaged or destroyed, a genuinely staggering cost paid in the effort to bring home 2 men who ultimately survived. This is not a detail to be glossed over in favor of the more inspiring ending. It is a central, difficult part of what this story actually cost, and it deserves to be remembered with the same weight given to the rescue's eventual success. This honest accounting matters because it reveals something true about the actual choices American commanders faced throughout that difficult stretch of days. The decision to keep attempting rescue, even after early losses, and the later decision to change methods entirely once those losses grew too severe to justify, both reflected genuine, difficult judgment calls made under real uncertainty by men trying to bring 2 American airmen home without knowing in advance exactly which approach would eventually succeed or at what further cost. Hambleton survived his ordeal and lived for decades afterward, and in the years that followed, he thought often about the specific, staggering scale of what had actually been risked and lost in the effort to bring him home. He came to understand, with time and with access to the fuller accounting of the rescue that only became available to him after the fact, that his own survival had been purchased at a cost considerably higher than he had any way of knowing while he was still alone on the ground, evading capture day after day with no clear sense of whether anyone would actually reach him in time. Learning, in the years afterward, the full scale of the aircraft lost and the men killed in the effort to save him produced a weight he carried for the rest of his life, a gratitude inseparable from a genuine, lasting grief for the cost his own survival had required from other men's families. He thought, too, about the specific, deliberate courage of the 2 men who had finally succeeded where so many larger efforts had failed, understanding in a way that only grew clearer with time exactly what it must have taken for Norris and Kyatt to move quietly through ground that had already destroyed multiple helicopters and killed multiple crews attempting the same basic task by louder, more conventional means. Their success had not been luck. It had been a different, more disciplined kind of courage, built around patience and restraint rather than overwhelming force, succeeding precisely because it refused to repeat the approach that had already proven, at such cost, exactly what that ground could do to anyone trying to cross it the wrong way. And he came in his later years to a settled understanding of what his own rescue actually represented, beyond his personal gratitude for having survived it. It stood as proof of something his own country had been willing to demonstrate, at real and serious cost, about the value it placed on bringing its own people home, even when doing so required accepting losses that, by any purely rational military calculation, might have argued for simply writing the mission off far earlier than anyone actually chose to. Here is what the rescue of Gene Hambleton actually reveals, and why the scale of what was risked to save him matters as much as the fact that the rescue eventually succeeded. A single-downed airman, however valuable his knowledge, does not automatically justify unlimited cost in blood and equipment by any cold, purely rational military calculation. And yet the American command in Vietnam kept trying, attempt after costly attempt, even as the toll climbed to a level that eventually forced a change in method rather than a decision to simply accept the loss and move on. That persistence and the eventual willingness to change approach entirely, rather than either give up or keep repeating a method that had already proven too costly, reveals something genuine about the value a nation can place on refusing to leave its own people behind, even when the arithmetic of that refusal grows difficult to justify in purely tactical terms. That is the real meaning behind the story, and it reaches well past 1 navigator and 11.5 days on the ground. Sometimes the right response to a failing strategy is not more of the same effort, applied with greater force. It is the humility to recognize that overwhelming power, however successful it has been before, has real limits, and that the actual solution might require doing the opposite of what instinct and prior success both suggest. Trading force for patience and scale for quiet, deliberate skill. The helicopters and fighters that tried and failed to reach Hambleton were not a mistake. They were the natural, well-founded first response of a military that had, throughout the rest of the war, generally been able to solve exactly this kind of problem with exactly that kind of force. It simply was not the answer this specific, unprecedented situation actually required. Gene Hambleton parachuted into a rice paddy in the middle of the largest offensive of the entire war, carrying knowledge valuable enough that his own country was willing to spend an extraordinary amount of blood and machinery trying to bring him home. The effort that finally succeeded looked nothing like the effort that had already failed so many times before it. 2 quiet men in a small boat, disguised as fishermen, moving patiently through the same ground that had already destroyed helicopters and killed their crews. That is why one pilot's rescue became one of the largest and costliest recovery operations of the entire war, and why the answer, when it finally came, arrived not through more force, but through less. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the extraordinary lengths one nation went to in order to bring a single man home on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a pilot, a rescue crewman, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.